At precisely 7:04 a.m., just as the sun was casting a soft golden hue over the rooftops of our suburban battlefield, a blood-curdling metallic screech tore through the peace. It came from above, not the heavens, but the apex of a homemade roller coaster, arching 20 feet into the sky before swooping over a suspiciously brand new fence that had no right to exist. The cart, a bright red single-seater I'd named Justice Express, rattled as it descended with glorious speed, momentarily catching the wind before landing with a thud and vanishing behind my garage. Below, standing next to the very fence she had so smugly constructed just 3 weeks prior, was Karen. Bathrobe flapping like a battle flag, mouth agape, her perfectly sprayed helmet of blonde curls unmoved by the chaos around her. She stared upward, as though trying to make sense of a world where her control didn't reign supreme. And I sipped my coffee. I was already outside on my porch, mug in hand, calm as a monk meditating atop a mountain of spite. The look on Karen's face, some unholy cocktail of horror, disbelief, and a very specific kind of suburban rage usually reserved for missed Amazon packages, was everything I had hoped it would be. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, no doubt already halfway through dialing the HOA hotline, convinced that this act of vertical vengeance must somehow violate the sacred scrolls of community regulation. But me, I didn't flinch. I merely raised my mug, tipped it in her direction like a salute, and said, "Still think the fence was a good idea?" Of course, to really appreciate why there was now a roller coaster perched across the sky over a fence that shouldn't exist, you need to rewind. You need to go back to the moment I stepped outside in fuzzy slippers, expecting to greet the morning with birdsong, and not the sight of 2 contractors drilling posts directly into my land. You need to meet the woman who believed that her laminated HOA badge gave her the divine right to reassign property lines. Someone who saw my backyard not as private space, but as a blank canvas for her vision of community enhancement. Karen wasn't just a person. She was a force. A walking, talking embodiment of unchecked suburban entitlement. Her favorite words were compliance, common good, and you'll be hearing from the board. She operated with the smug certainty of someone who thought property lines were optional if she printed her arguments in bold and underlined them. And she believed, truly believed, that a fence, her fence, erected 6 inches over the boundary into my yard, was not only justified, but noble. I disagreed. And where she used paperwork, threats, and passive-aggressive flyers, I decided to use gravity, physics, and a little amusement park flair. The coaster wasn't just my response, it was my message, my signature on the absurd contract she had written with her arrogance. This war didn't start with blueprints and welding. It started with a fence that should never have existed, a fence that dared to claim what was mine. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a declaration of war, and I was going to win it, one loop at a time. It started with a noise. Not the kind of noise you expect in a sleepy cul-de-sac at 6:30 in the morning. Not birdsong or lawn sprinklers or the gentle hum of a car warming up. No, this was a harsh, grating sound. Metal on concrete. A mechanical kind of groaning that didn't belong anywhere near my backyard. I stumbled out of bed, still wrapped in the fog of sleep, and tugged open my blinds with the expectation of seeing a city maintenance truck, or maybe one of the neighbor kids getting creative with a leaf blower. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. 2 men in orange vests hammering wooden stakes into the earth, right on the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely they were lost or had misread their instructions. So I did what any sane, caffeinated adult would do. I threw on a hoodie over my pajamas, shoved my feet into a pair of flip-flops, and marched out into the yard. The gravel was still cold under my feet, and the dew hadn't yet evaporated. As I approached, one of the workers glanced up, nodded politely, and returned to drilling a post into the ground. My ground. That's when I noticed the string line stretching between the wooden stakes, and that's when the fear turned into fury. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "What exactly are you building here?" The taller of the two men gestured toward a clipboard. "Per the HOA directive, we're installing a fence extension. Runs from the corner of the community park all the way through here. Should be done by noon tomorrow." I blinked. "Through where?" "This is my yard." He gave a half shrug, the kind that said "not my problem," and went back to drilling. Before I could even begin to argue, I heard the unmistakable sound of wedge heels crunching across a gravel path. That sound had become a warning bell over the past year. And then I saw her. Karen. She arrived like a storm disguised as a PTA mom. Bouncy blonde curls, oversized sunglasses, a pink fleece vest zipped up to her chin, and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. She wore that smug, tight-lipped smile I'd come to recognize as a precursor to madness. "Oh, good," she said cheerfully, as if we were discussing a bake sale. "I was hoping to catch you. The board voted last week on the new fence parameters. It's part of our community enhancement plan, a unified border around the HOA zone. Clean lines, uniform aesthetic, you understand." "No," I said bluntly. "I don't understand. This is my yard." She blinked behind those massive sunglasses. "It's not personal. It's just a minor encroachment, a few feet at most, but it improves symmetry and enhances security. You're not in the HOA, but the board felt it would be a win-win for the whole street." I felt my blood pressure climb several stories higher than my house. "Let me be clear. This land, this exact patch of grass right here, is on my property deed. You can't just build a fence through it." She tilted her head, all innocence and condescension. "You're not being very neighborly. You know, it's attitudes like that that disrupt cohesion. This is a shared community." "No, it's a neighborhood," I said, "not a commune, and I didn't share anything with you." For a moment we just stared at each other, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the absurdity of it all. The workers kept hammering, oblivious to the brewing storm. Karen adjusted her clipboard like she was about to read me my rights. "You'll be receiving a formal notice," she said at last. "You're welcome to file a complaint, but I'd advise you to think twice. This is a board decision, and you're one household out of 52. I'm also the only household that owns this land," I snapped. Karen didn't flinch. She was too practiced for that. Instead, she pulled a folded document from her vest. It was a map, crudely marked, color-coded, and highlighted within an inch of its life. On it, my backyard was bisected by a bold green line labeled "Future Fence Placement." She handed it to me like it was a peace treaty, then turned on her heel and walked off. I stood there dumbfounded, holding the paper like it might catch fire. I looked at the workers, still busy digging into what was undeniably my soil, and then back to the spot where Karen had disappeared like a smug spectre into the morning light. That night, I barely slept. I spent hours poring over my property documents, pulling up satellite imagery, measuring distances with the kind of precision usually reserved for missile launches. And everything confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Karen had crossed the line. Literally, figuratively, legally. By the next morning, the fence was half built. I stood in my kitchen, staring out at the absurd sight of a pale grey wooden barrier slicing into my yard like an uninvited limb. It wasn't just a fence. It was a monument to disrespect, a declaration that she could, and would, rewrite the rules whenever it suited her, and dare anyone to stop her. I wasn't just angry. I was motivated. And if Karen wanted to play construction queen on land she didn't own, I was going to give her a front row seat to my version of suburban development. Something with a little more thrill, a little more speed, and a whole lot of message. The battle had begun, and I wasn't building a wall. I was building a ride. 2 days after the fence went up, a letter arrived, tucked neatly into my mailbox, sealed in an envelope with the unmistakable HOA crest. A silhouette of a tree, a picket fence, and a house that looked far too smug for something printed on stationery. I unfolded the letter slowly, half expecting an apology, or perhaps a request to discuss matters further. Instead, I found a page dripping with bureaucratic doublespeak, as if someone had swallowed a thesaurus on urban planning, and then vomited it onto legal-sized paper. The letter began with a cheerful, almost condescending greeting, thanking me for my continued support in fostering a cohesive and aesthetically unified community. Then came the hammer. According to revised boundary allocations and the HOA's newly adopted Visual Harmony Ordinance, the recent fence installation was fully compliant with Article 9, Section B of the Community Planning Guidelines. I reread that sentence 3 times, each time feeling my eyebrows creep further up my forehead. They were trying to rewrite reality. According to the letter, the slight encroachment into my yard was a temporary enhancement approved by the board as part of the neighborhood connectivity project. It even included a grainy, photocopied map, clearly edited by a colorblind toddler with access to highlighters, where my backyard was shaded over in light blue and labeled Shared Green Access Zone. I felt my eye twitch as I reached the final paragraph, where they thanked me again for my cooperative spirit and reminded me that any resistance could result in a review by the Conflict Resolution Committee, which sounded more like a cult than a civic group. By the time I finished reading, I realized what was happening. This wasn't just Karen being annoying. This was psychological warfare dressed up in official jargon and Home Depot formatting. She was trying to gaslight me into thinking I'd agreed to this, into believing I was somehow the unreasonable one for objecting to someone erecting a fence on my lawn like it was an IKEA shelf. But I hadn't lost my mind. I had photos, I had property records, and I had common sense. 3 things that Karen and her clipboard brigade clearly lacked. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch sipping my stress relief chamomile, another neighbor approached. I hadn't spoken to Nancy much before, other than a polite nod when collecting mail or exchanging holiday pleasantries. She was holding a flyer, a thin, glossy sheet featuring a stock photo of a family smiling behind a picket fence, and the words, "Protecting our community starts with you." Underneath, it read, "Don't let one homeowner derail our progress." And next to that, a crude outline of my property with a giant red X drawn over it. Nancy sighed. "This was taped to my door this morning. Figured you should know." I thanked her and took the flyer. It reeked of Karen's passive-aggressive PR campaign, smiling clip art and veiled threats. It accused me of obstructing community beautification and jeopardizing the neighborhood's property values. It urged residents to stand firm against selfish obstructionists. There was even a quote at the bottom attributed to concerned neighbors, which I assumed was Karen's fancy way of saying herself and maybe her cat. That night, I got a visit from Greg, another neighbor I barely knew. He held up a piece of paper with a clipboard under his arm. "Karen asked me to get signatures for a petition," he said hesitantly. "It's to affirm support for the new fence plan. She said you were refusing to cooperate and that the board needs proof the community agrees." I stared at him. "And you believed her?" He looked sheepish. "Honestly, I don't care about the fence, but she made it sound like you were being hostile." I took a deep breath and invited him in. We sat at the kitchen table, where I laid out my property deed, the zoning map from the city, and a few photos from before the fence went up. Greg listened, then frowned. "Okay, yeah, this is messed up." He left without asking for a signature. The next morning, I found another envelope. This one stuck to my door with blue painter's tape. Inside was a final notice of non-compliance, this time quoting a completely different section of the bylaws that didn't even apply to me since I wasn't an HOA member. It warned that continued interference could lead to fines, and suggested I attend the next HOA meeting to discuss a resolution. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. This wasn't about resolution. It was about control. Karen was trying to rewrite the narrative, turning herself into the victim and me into the villain. But I wasn't playing her game. She could flood the neighborhood with paperwork, flyers, and phony petitions. I had truth, facts, and something she didn't expect. A plan of my own. She wanted to build a fence? Fine. I was going to build something louder, something that couldn't be ignored, something that soared. By the end of the week, my mailbox was beginning to resemble a war memorial, stuffed with warning letters, passive-aggressive reminders, and enough HOA literature to start a small bonfire. Each envelope seemed more desperate than the last, as though they believed sheer volume could override actual property rights. The final straw wasn't even a letter. It was a notice taped to my garbage bin, declaring that my failure to comply with the neighborhood boundary beautification plan would result in a $350 administrative fine and potential loss of amenity privileges. I didn't have any amenity privileges. I wasn't even part of the HOA. That was the moment I picked up the phone and called Chad. Chad wasn't just a friend. He was the kind of friend who kept scanned PDFs of property laws on his desktop and had memorized more case citations than most judges. He was also a real estate lawyer, with a mean streak for people who used clipboards as weapons. The moment I started explaining the situation, he interrupted me. Wait, they built a fence on your property? Yep. And they're trying to fine you even though you're not part of the HOA? Double yep. He snorted. Tell them to shove their fine into the bylaws section where the sun doesn't shine. Chad didn't waste time. Within 48 hours, I had a formal legal response drafted and printed on thick, impressive paper that screamed, "You messed with the wrong suburbanite." It stated in clear terms that I was not a member of the HOA, had never signed any documents consenting to its jurisdiction, and that any further attempt to assert control over my property would be considered harassment. It also requested the immediate removal of the unauthorized fence and warned that failure to do so would result in a lawsuit for trespassing, illegal construction, and property damage. I hand-delivered a copy to the HOA office, slid it under the glass door just below their inspirational poster about community unity, and mailed another to the official HOA mailing address, certified with signature confirmation. Karen wasn't going to be able to pretend this one got lost in the shuffle. The reaction was swift. 2 days later, the same 2 men who had hammered the first fence post into my lawn returned, this time without tools, without smiles, and definitely without a clipboard. They looked sheepish, like kids sent to apologize after breaking a neighbor's window. One of them muttered something about miscommunication and just following orders. They took down the section of the fence that had trespassed onto my yard without saying a word, like someone dismantling a bad decision in real time. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as the pieces of Karen's empire of arrogance were quietly hauled away in a rusted pickup truck. I didn't say anything. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, sipping, letting the silence do all the talking. But the best part came later that evening, when Chad called again. He was practically giggling. So, get this, he said. I dug into their bylaws and found that your property was never included in the HOA boundary map. Not even originally. Karen's been operating on assumptions, not legal agreements. She overstepped. Badly. I let that sink in. All of her emails, all her flyers, all those letters taped to my mailbox, they weren't just obnoxious. They were fiction. A fantasy held together with wishful thinking and a whole lot of printed nonsense. This wasn't just a minor win. It was a full-blown checkmate. Karen might have struck first, but now I had a legal shield, and behind that shield, I was about to build something she'd never see coming. Not a fence, not a wall, but something faster, taller, louder, and far more fun. The idea came to me in the most ridiculous way possible, while watching a documentary about abandoned amusement parks. There, between clips of rusted teacup rides and graffiti-covered tilt-a-whirls, was a segment on backyard engineers, people who, through an unholy combination of boredom, spite, and leftover construction materials, had built full-scale roller coasters in their yards. That was the moment the light bulb went off. While most people would settle for a fence dispute letter, or maybe a carefully worded email, I had something far better in mind. If Karen wanted to draw lines, I was going to ride over them. That night I didn't sleep. I wasn't tossing and turning out of stress or anger. I was electrified by inspiration. I dusted off an old sketchbook, one that hadn't seen daylight since my brief post-college obsession with theme park architecture, and began sketching. The line of the first drop, the curve that would hover directly over the fence she'd tried to steal space with. A loop? Maybe. But definitely a climb, and definitely a descent. One so swift and dramatic, it would rattle her lawn gnomes out of position. I started with research. I binged roller coaster design videos, safety guidelines, DIY projects, and forums filled with slightly unhinged but incredibly committed engineers. There was a whole world of backyard thrill-seekers out there, and I studied every nut and bolt. Turns out building a coaster wasn't impossible. Complicated? Yes. Dangerous? Maybe. Illegal? Surprisingly, no. If you got the right permits and didn't charge admission. I called Chad the lawyer just to double-check. "You're planning what?" he asked, half laughing. "Roller coaster." He was quiet for a moment. "As long as it stays on your land, meets basic structural safety, and doesn't violate noise ordinances." "Technically, yeah. You could build one." "Technically." That was all I needed to hear. I reached out to my cousin Jake, a welder who owed me a favor after I helped him move a pool table up 3 flights of stairs last summer. Jake was more intrigued than shocked. "You want to build what now?" I told him the plan. I described the layout. I explained, in vivid detail, how the coaster's track would arc high enough to sail right over Karen's fence like a monument to over-the-top defiance. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. Jake brought in his buddy Tom, a structural engineer who moonlit as a creator of metal art installations. The guy had built a rotating sculpture shaped like a dragon for a Renaissance fair, so my roller coaster idea was practically tame by comparison. Tom reviewed the sketches, took some measurements, and gave a single nod. "We'll need steel, concrete footings, and a hell of a lot of bolts." Materials were ordered. The groundwork began the next weekend. The sight of cement bags, rebar, and scaffolding arriving in my yard was enough to send the entire neighborhood into gossip overdrive. From my porch, I watched blinds twitch, cell phones rise behind windows, and the HOA group chat, yes, I had a friend who leaked me screenshots, explode with phrases like, "What's being built next door?" and "Is that legal?" And of course, Karen must be furious. And she was. She showed up on day 2, flanked by her clipboard, and a man I assumed was either her husband or an unfortunate neighbor roped into her crusade. She stood just outside my property line, tapping her pen furiously against the metal rail that had just been anchored into a fresh concrete base. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. I grinned. "Personal amusement structure. Fully permitted." "This is a residential area." "Correct." "It's a violation of community harmony." "Also correct. But not illegal." Her eyes narrowed. "You're building a carnival ride in your backyard to mock a fence." "No," I said, letting the pause stretch. "I'm building a memory. One people will talk about for years." Karen huffed, pivoted, and stormed off with enough theatrical fury to warrant her own soundtrack. I made a note to install speakers on the first hill, Maybe some dramatic orchestral music, something operatic and triumphant. Construction took 2 weeks. Steel frame, welded joints, wooden supports, a secure track with a safety cart and seatbelt harness. Jake and Tom worked like men on a mission. I ordered a camera drone to capture aerial footage. I documented everything, just in case Karen tried to accuse me of building a death trap. I even had the local inspector come by for a look. He stood under the structure, scratched his chin, and finally said, "You know what? I've seen worse ideas." The final piece was the sign. Mounted on a post just beside the coaster's loading platform, I had a plaque made. Engraved in big, bold letters, "The Karen Coaster, built in honor of unsolicited fences and uninvited control." And underneath that, in italics, "You built a fence, I built a ride." The day it launched, I wore aviator sunglasses and a cape, just because. The cart zipped down the track with a satisfying whir of wheels and wind. It soared, it glided, it hummed through the air and passed directly over Karen's backyard, like a low-flying dose of poetic justice. She stood in the grass below, mouth agape, frozen in the shade of my homemade monument to retaliation. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she had no words. But I did. "Enjoy the view," I called down. "It's a one-of-a-kind ride, just like your nerve." The coaster wasn't even finished when the neighborhood began losing its collective mind. By the third morning of construction, half of the cul-de-sac had already rearranged their morning walk routines, just to get a glimpse of the spectacle rising in my backyard. Steel rails shimmered in the sun, looping higher with each passing day. A wooden staircase snaked its way to the launch platform, like a stairway to suburban vengeance. And towering above it all, fastened with industrial bolts and quiet fury, was the first drop. A magnificent slope, angled perfectly to glide over Karen's fence, with a gracefulness entirely undeserved by the person it mocked. But grace wasn't what this project evoked in Karen. Chaos, however. It summoned that in spades. She started small. At first it was the noise complaints. She claimed construction was happening outside of allowed hours, even though I had a copy of the city's ordinance and had taped it to my garage door in anticipation. Then came the baseless safety warnings. She took pictures from her yard, zoomed in, and emailed the HOA board with subject lines like "Urgent death trap next door" and "Unregulated rollercoaster puts neighborhood children at risk." She conveniently ignored that there were no children within 6 houses of mine, and that my build site was fenced off like a military testing zone. Still, the HOA bit. On the 4th day, a surprise delegation arrived. 3 members of the board, all wearing matching navy polos embroidered with the HOA logo, walked up my driveway like they were serving a warrant. One carried a clipboard, another a camera, and the third had a laminated copy of the bylaws, standard issue in any Karen-initiated offensive. "We're here to evaluate the structure," the clipboard guy said, trying to sound authoritative. I didn't even let him finish. "This is private property. You're not entering without a warrant or my permission." He stammered. "We're conducting a neighborhood compliance review." "For what? I'm not in the HOA. We've received reports of disturbances." I smiled, leaning slightly against a support beam that had just been secured with a bolt the size of a soup can. "Disturbances like what? The sound of welding? Or the sound of someone finally standing up to your queen?" The camera guy looked like he wanted to shrink into his cargo shorts. The bylaws lady cleared her throat. "We'll be filing a report." "You do that," I said, turning back toward the build site. "Make sure to spell my name right on your complaint." They left without crossing the threshold of my property, but their presence marked the beginning of what I now refer to as the week of shenanigans. That's when the HOA truly lost the plot. First, they sent another notice. this time attempting to invoke a vague clause about unapproved vertical structures. It referenced aesthetic disruption, potential property value deflation, and the psychological impact of aggressive architecture. Chad, my lawyer friend, laughed so hard he had to mute the call before reading the response he drafted. It pointed out that the clause applied only to members of the HOA, didn't mention height restrictions on temporary backyard installations, and most importantly, didn't override local zoning laws, which I was still well within. Then came the petition, again. This one had a new title, Emergency Community Action Against Dangerous Attractions. It had 15 signatures, 2 of them legible, one apparently signed by Buster the Beagle, and another by someone who listed their title as Neighborhood Vigilante. I framed it and hung it in the garage next to the blueprint of the coaster. The real panic set in when I installed the cart. It arrived in a crate the size of a compact car, bright red, single seat, with a safety bar that clicked into place with a satisfying clunk. When we set it on the track and gave it a slow test push from the top of the first hill, it coasted down with a whistle of wind, rounded the final curve, and came to a gentle stop with perfect alignment. The cheer that erupted from my small crew might as well have been the roar of a championship crowd. The HOA, however, responded with something closer to a crisis hotline. Karen returned that afternoon. No clipboard this time. Just rage. She marched right up to the edge of my lawn, now marked with a fresh string of no trespassing signs, and shouted at the top of her lungs, "You've turned this into a circus." "Wrong," I replied without looking up from my tablet, where I was reviewing footage from the coaster's first test run. "A circus has clowns. I've got engineers. You're destroying the fabric of this community. If your fabric was this fragile, it was already unraveling." That night, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I know because someone slipped a printed flyer under my door. It featured a blurry photo of the coaster with the headline, "Call to Action, Protect Our Peace." There was also a subheading that read, "Do we want a Six Flags in our backyards?" I added it to my growing collection of HOA memorabilia. Meanwhile, neighbors began to choose sides. Some were amused, others quietly supportive, and a few, mostly Karen's loyalists, began clutching their pearl necklaces whenever they walked past my house. One guy actually brought me cookies, said his teenage son thought the coaster was the most badass thing ever, and asked if he could ride it when it was finished. I told him he'd have to sign a waiver and bring his own helmet. He agreed without hesitation. The climax of the chaos came when someone, not naming names but likely wearing a certain shade of pink, called in a safety inspector. He arrived with a hard hat, clipboard, and a slightly amused expression. After a thorough inspection, he turned to me and said, "Honestly, it's overbuilt. This thing could probably survive a tornado. You're in the clear." Karen was across the street, watching from behind her blinds like a spy in a soap opera. I raised a mug of coffee in her direction. She didn't wave back. The HOA had tried every petty maneuver they could think of. Letters, meetings, threats, drama. But none of it could touch the steel rails now weaving through my backyard like a declaration in metal and bolts. Their rules meant nothing here, because they had built a fence. And I was building a legend. Launch day arrived with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for space missions or publicized celebrity breakdowns. I woke before the alarm, not out of nerves, but with the excited energy of a man about to make local history. The sky was clear, the sun was generous, and the steel of the coaster gleamed like a monument to every time I'd bitten my tongue, instead of shouting, "Get off my lawn." I had coffee in one hand, a GoPro mounted to the cart, and my phone ready to stream the first ride live for a few select viewers, namely Chad, Jake, Tom, and my cousin Rachel, who had once said I'd never commit to anything long-term unless it had wheels. We ran final checks like a flight crew. Safety restraints? Locked. Track alignment? Double-checked. Support integrity? Rock solid. The coaster cart, affectionately named Karen's Kryptonite, sat at the top of the hill with a soft whir of anticipation from the small electric winch that would give it the initial nudge. Tom gave a thumbs up from the base. Jake gave me a salute from the launch platform, and I, perched inside the cart, with a helmet and a grin that could have powered the neighborhood, pressed the release button. With a satisfying mechanical hiss, the winch clicked, and gravity took over. The cart rolled forward, slowly at first, then faster, gliding down the initial incline like it was born for this exact moment. The track flexed slightly, smoothly, as it banked into the wide curve, gaining momentum. And then, there it was, the apex. The cart soared directly over Karen's fence, the very one that had sparked this glorious descent into suburban chaos. The air whooshed past my ears, the wind caught in my jacket, and I shouted, not out of fear, but triumph. The cart cruised through the final bend, slowed gently, and clicked to a stop right where it was supposed to. It was beautiful, smooth, clean, precise, and it drove Karen absolutely insane. She had been standing at the corner of her yard the entire time, arms folded, lips compressed into a line so tight it looked like it was trying to escape her face. The moment the cart stopped and I climbed out, she stormed across her lawn with the fury of a Roman general watching enemy flags planted on their soil. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she screamed, marching to the edge of my property line like it still belonged to her. I took off the helmet slowly, theatrically. "Looks like I'm enjoying my private property. Want a turn?" "You're endangering lives. You're endangering the peace. This is a residential zone, not a Six Flags." "Funny," I said. "I've never heard a roller coaster described with so much passion by someone who built a fence on land they didn't own." "You're being ridiculous. This is harassment." "No, Karen," I said, stepping closer, voice steady. "You built an illegal fence, tried to rewrite my deed with a map from Microsoft Paint, distributed flyers with my house circled like I was a wanted criminal, and called the city to shut me down. I built a coaster over it." She stood there, shaking with rage, eyes flicking from the towering frame behind me to the still rolling footage on my phone. "I'm calling the authorities," she snapped. "They've already been here. You should have seen the inspector. He was a fan." That was when her meltdown truly began. She spun around, stomped toward her house, and then, in what can only be described as a full-on theatrical breakdown, tripped over one of her own decorative lawn rocks and tumbled onto the grass. She flailed, groaned, and lay there for a solid 10 seconds like a fainting Victorian heiress. I waited, concerned for about half a heartbeat, before seeing her peek up to see if I was watching. I was. She scrambled upright with a snarl, limped to her front steps, and slammed the door with enough force to shake her plastic seasonal wreath. Within 20 minutes, the HOA forum exploded. My insider contact forwarded me screenshots. Posts flooded in with titles like, "This has gone too far," "Rollercoaster menace strikes again," and "Do we really want thrill rides in our backyard?" But there were also replies. Beautiful, sarcastic replies, from other residents clearly enjoying the chaos. One wrote, "At least someone's adding value to the neighborhood. I'd pay to ride it." Another commented, "Karen should have just apologized for the fence. Now she has a theme park next door." That afternoon, local kids started showing up. I didn't let them ride, of course, not without parental permission and proper safety gear. But their parents smiled, waved, and gave knowing nods. One dad offered me a 6-pack of beer just for standing your ground in the most dramatic way possible. Another neighbor suggested I install concession stands. Karen remained indoors. That evening, I uploaded the footage to a private YouTube link with the title, "When HOA Karen Builds a Fence on Your Property, So You Build a Coaster Over It." Within hours, Chad sent me a text. "You're going viral. Please build a log flume next." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows from the coaster frame across the lawn. I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching the neighborhood adjust to its new skyline. The tension that had clung to every HOA meeting, every passive-aggressive flyer, every forced smile at the mailbox, it all felt like it had cracked. Maybe not shattered, but definitely fractured. People weren't afraid anymore. Not of Karen, not of speaking up. Because today I hadn't just launched a coaster. I had launched a message. One that flew right over her fence and landed squarely in her empire of entitlement. And the best part, I was just getting started. Just when I thought Karen had finally exhausted her arsenal of absurdities, she revealed her final weapon, a forged legal document with the subtlety of a crayon drawing and the authority of a damp napkin. It arrived in a thick manila envelope, hand-delivered by what I can only assume was one of her minions, a jittery teenager who sprinted away before I could even thank him for the free entertainment. The envelope had no return address, only a label reading, "Urgent legal action enclosed," which, in typical Karen fashion, was typed in Comic Sans. Inside was what she clearly believed to be her checkmate move, an injunction. It bore the title, "Immediate Cease and Desist Order Regarding Unsafe Recreational Structure," issued by something called the Neighborhood Judicial Oversight Division, which, to the best of my knowledge, is not a real thing in any functioning legal system. The document was formatted like she'd Googled court order template, pasted my name into every paragraph and hit print. It had a digital-looking signature at the bottom, Judge Lionel J. Burke, and an official-looking watermark that, upon closer inspection, was just a low-resolution clip art of a gavel. The content was a fever dream. It claimed that my roller coaster posed serious psychological trauma risk to nearby residents, and cited studies with titles like "The Dangers of Suburban Thrill Rides on Domestic Peace." There was a section accusing me of operating a commercial amusement facility without county permits, and another that demanded I immediately dismantle the structure within 72 hours or face civil penalties, HOA disciplinary action, and removal by community enforcement unit. That last part made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. Community enforcement unit. What was this? A suburban SWAT team armed with pool skimmers and hedge clippers. I scanned every page, underlined the grammatical errors, and took pictures of the fake watermark. Then I did what any sane person would do. I sent the entire thing to Chad. He called me within 10 minutes, barely able to get words out between laughs. "She created a fake legal entity," he said. "This is like trying to sue someone with a Monopoly card." "Can I frame it?" "You should. But first, send it to the county clerk. This crosses into legal impersonation." So I did. I compiled the document, attached a formal statement, and included a copy of the security footage showing the delivery, just for good measure. The clerk responded faster than expected, confirming that there was no Judge Lionel J. Burke in the county, no judicial oversight division by that name, and no legal action pending against me of any kind. That response alone would have been enough, but I wanted to make sure Karen got the message. The next morning, I printed out the county's reply, taped it to my mailbox, and wrote across the top in bold red marker, "Nice try." That evening, she returned to the scene of her failed ambush. She lingered at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, lips pursed into a sour line that could curdle milk. She didn't approach, she didn't shout. But the look she gave me, equal parts rage, confusion, and the slow realization that she had officially run out of moves, was better than any words. She'd tried fences, fake bylaws, social pressure, public humiliation, and now phony injunctions. But none of it worked. Because no matter how many weapons she hurled at me, I had one thing she couldn't fabricate: the truth. And now it was bolted into my backyard, humming on rails, rising above every petty attempt to control me. Karen hadn't just lost the battle. She had forged her own defeat. It started with a single post. I uploaded the GoPro footage from the first launch to a small YouTube channel I hadn't touched in years, gave it a cheeky title: HOA Karen put up a fence on my property, so I built a roller coaster over it, and thought nothing more of it. I figured a few friends would watch. Maybe Chad would share it with his law buddies for a laugh. What I didn't expect was to wake up the next morning to 5,000 views and a growing thread of comments ranging from "This is the most glorious revenge I've ever seen" to "Where can I buy the blueprints?" By noon, it had hit 20,000, then 50. Someone shared it on Reddit with the headline, "This guy just built the ultimate HOA deterrent," and it exploded from there. The video made it to the front page, with people dissecting every detail: the build process, Karen's meltdown, even the fact that I wore aviators and a cape for the launch. Memes followed quickly. One was a split image of Karen screaming and me sipping coffee, captioned, "Karen tried to build a wall. He built a legacy." Another was just a roller coaster photo with bold white letters: "Let them fence. You ride." Local media picked it up first. A news van parked outside my house a few days later. The reporter, a young guy with perfect hair and a sense of humor, asked if I'd be willing to do a quick interview. I walked him through everything, showed him the fake injunction, the HOA flyers, the coaster itself, and by the end, even he was grinning. The segment aired under the title, "Neighborhood Dispute Reaches New Heights," literally. Soon after, the emails started. People from all over the country, some even from overseas, reached out to say how much they loved the story. A guy from Oregon asked for coaster plans. A woman in Texas said she was battling her own HOA and found the video inspirational. One dad said his son now wanted to build a roller coaster instead of a treehouse. I started getting offers for interviews, sponsorships, even a proposal to turn the story into a short documentary. Somehow, this ridiculous feud, born from a 6-foot fence and unchecked entitlement, had turned into a legend. My backyard was no longer just a yard. It was a symbol. And Karen, she'd become an internet myth, proof that some battles you start with a clipboard, but lose to a welding torch and a little imagination. It's funny how quiet the neighborhood became after the storm passed. No more surprise notices in my mailbox. No more HOA flyers taped to my trash bins. No more sideways glances from Karen as she plotted her next move behind freshly trimmed hedges. Just silence, the kind that stretches over sidewalks and settles in the spaces between houses like an overdue peace offering. Karen didn't show her face much after the video went viral. Her once daily patrols of the neighborhood stopped altogether. The HOA meetings, once filled with whispers of expansion and compliance, now shifted focus to community gardens and pothole repairs. The fire in her campaign fizzled not with a bang, but with an awkward whimper, and eventually she resigned from the board for personal reasons. No one clapped. No one asked her to stay. I kept the coaster. Not just because it made the backyard feel alive, but because it meant something now. Something bigger than bolts and rails. Every time I watched the cart zip over that cursed fence line, I was reminded that standing your ground doesn't always mean yelling the loudest or throwing the biggest punch. Sometimes, it just means being willing to build something that says, in the clearest way possible, "You don't get to redraw my boundaries." People still drive by sometimes. They slow down, roll down their windows, and point. Some stop to ask if the coaster's real. Others just smile. A few kids on bikes gave me a thumbs up last week and shouted, "Legend," as they rode past. I laughed, waved, and went back to watering the plants. This whole thing started with a fence. A few planks of wood placed where they didn't belong. But it ended with a ride, a message in motion, that made it crystal clear. Some lines, when crossed, don't just divide. They ignite. And when they do, you don't retreat. You rise.